I wanted to begin this part of the session with a quotation from Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, who said, "In our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon our heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." And I hope that we, in a session before this, when we had a number of panelists who had served with Sergio around the world, we focused on what can be learned by this tragedy, and perhaps we can do a little bit of that tonight as well. So why don't we begin with commentaries or questions. I think one question we have is, would Carolina like to join us up here, or would you like to stay there?
Yes.
So I think we'll entertain questions. They end with a question mark. But you can also, if you want to make a statement or if you want to frame your question with a brief commentary beforehand, that'll be acceptable as well. I can't see up there very well, so you may have to come to some place where there's a microphone here and a microphone stand here. So I think it'd be better if you came to those stands, and then if you come to this one, I'll repeat your question. So.
People usually need a little bit of time, so you might want to ask a question to start. Just, I don't know, maybe.
Well, I think that we might begin by asking both you, Samantha, the challenges you had in writing this book, and perhaps in Greg and the challenges he had in making this film, because they're both extraordinary works.
I think none compare, obviously, with the challenges that Carolina experienced on the day and since. So it's great to be up here with you, and it's great you're here as a student. I keep telling Greg he's got to update the Chiron and say, no, she's at the Kennedy School. I mean, I guess just briefly, I told this to Greg the other night and others, but when the bomb went off, Carolina was in her office, Sergio was in his office. I was sitting at my computer in Winthrop, Massachusetts, writing what would become the introduction to a new issuance of Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. And the CNN came on and said there'd been this attack, and it even mentioned quite early, about an hour after the bomb, that Sergio was vulnerable, and that some question as to whether he'd been targeted, and I had known him in Bosnia and Kosovo and over the years, and I just knew he'd be okay, you know. So it was an incredibly sad event that the UN would be targeted. Nothing like that had happened previously, even in the history of the organization, you know, it would become a real learning moment for the organization. And a learning moment for others, too, about the nature of this particular breed of terrorists, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as it turned out. So I just assumed he'd dust himself off and comb his hair, and, you know, he'd be back to business. And when he died, I think, like many, you know, there's just a true disbelief. And then, you know, again, I hesitate to talk about our loss in sitting on a stage with Carolina, but the world lost somebody who, as I think I said in the film, was the go-to guy. And so as crisis begat crisis in the world, whether in Darfur or on Iran and nuclear weapons or whatever the issues were back in late 2003 and early 2004, you just felt this absence, just this huge gap in our sort of peacemaking truth-telling, fact-finding, figure-outing infrastructure as a world. And so I guess for me, the motivation, it was Cullen Murphy, an editor with the Atlantic Monthly. I described this feeling to him. He said, you should write an article on Sergio. As soon as I got into the reporting, I met Carolina and others and understood also the August 19th dimension of this. I realized that it wasn't just an article, that it was going to be something that would probably be in my life, probably for the rest of my life. So spent about a year looking at just that 3.5 hours of Sergio's life and Carolina's life, and she was instrumental, of course, in the retelling as she was in the film. But in a way, that was a way in. I mean, that tragedy was a metaphor, which we can talk about, but it was also just the drama of it in the intersection with the United States and these incredible heroes, flawed, again, like Sergio, like all of us, but heroes nonetheless. That seemed a way in for people to the life of someone that it wasn't clear they would naturally gravitate to in this country especially. And a UN bureaucrat, diplomat, what? Yeah, it was too much. So this, for me in the book, and then in conversations with Greg, which he can talk about, for the film, obviously, it seemed a way for people to relate not only to Sergio and the lessons of that life, but also to the drama and the stakes of what people like him and like Carolina and others, and many of you who are mid-careers or who are coming here and going off to do this kind of work are doing every day. It also was a visibility, a window into an international public servanthood that I think a lot of people want to go be, but not many people really know what that actually entails in terms of the pros and the cons. So it seemed really important to try to capture the lessons of that 34 years in the field as best I could in the book. And then I didn't know at the outset that I'd be blessed to have my favorite documentary filmmaker as a person who would then take it to the screen. But again, I couldn't have done any of it really without Carolina opening up her heart at great expense, of course, in reliving much of what she had gone through.
Thank you, Samantha. Greg, would you like to say a few words about the challenges of making the film?
Well, I mean, I'm humbled to be here with Carolina as I think back to the time we spent together in Geneva, where we did most of that interview over 2 long days over a weekend. And when you sit down like we did, and when I ask you as a filmmaker to retell the most intimate, horrific moments of your life, I know how hard that was for you, and I'm so incredibly grateful that you took those emotional risks. And I know from showing this film, at festivals and all that, and hear how moved people are by your honesty and your openness. And it's just an incredible privilege to be able to tell stories like that, and with such immediacy. Samantha and I had been talking about a possible film for a number of years as she was writing the book. And I had made a film about Rwanda some years ago for Frontline. I was interested in the United Nations as an institution and its flaws and its heroes. I knew some people who had worked with Sergio. I never met him myself, but I was intrigued. The problem from a filmmaking standpoint was that because he was everywhere for the last 30 years, every major crisis, it was difficult to decide what stories to actually tell. And as she was doing the research, which she sort of did chronologically going through his life, I didn't actually see a film in it, to be honest with you, because I couldn't find a narrative that I could just sort of grab onto. Until we sat down one day, not far from here, and she talked about her research into the Iraq mission, those months that he spent there, and in particularly the events of the 19th of August. And then I just saw the movie then. My intention was from the outset to make a film that spoke to a wide audience. I come from a public affairs, PBS background. I never saw this film really in that vein. I wanted to reach a general audience who might not really know anything or care much about the UN and probably didn't know who Sergio was, but maybe I could connect with them and inspire them by telling a story, the story that just worked on on a purely human level. And and a dramatic level. And so that was the source of inspiration. Then I had to, Samantha had interviewed 600 people or so for her book. I had to convince, Carolina and Bill and Andre and Gil and everybody else that to open themselves up to tell that story. And that's a huge emotional risk that they take. And I'm so grateful that people decided to do that. But from the outset, I decided to focus the film around that day, use that as the narrative spine, and then cut back into Sergio's life. And that was a tricky thing to pull off in the editing room. And my editor, Karen Schmier, who's one of the great documentary editors of her generation, who sadly is no longer with us, was really the artist behind all that and made it actually work in the cutting room.
Thank you, Greg. You mentioned the emotional risk that Carolina took by being in the film, and she took some by deciding to come this evening to the Q&A. And before we begin the Q&A, let me just ask Carolina if there's anything that she would like to say, or should we open it up to questions and answers? Okay, we'll just begin with questions and answers. I want to actually begin by asking, there were at least two people I know who were part of the panels this afternoon who served with Sergio in different parts of the world, Peter Galbraith and Claude Brunderlein. And if either of them wanted to make comments or make statements, I thought I'd give them the opportunity to do that before we begin the Q&A. So, Peter, would you like to?
You had told me in advance that I would be you asked me to do something, so I tried to think what it was about Sergio, and who I had known since we served together in Croatia and Bosnia. That's also when Samantha met Sergio. What was it about him that was something different from what you saw? And first, Greg and Samantha, I have to tell you what an extraordinary film that is. But it's a film that's very much centered on, I guess, Sergio's death and the way in which he died. And frankly, something that was, in my view, such a terrible waste. I mean, I know Iraq well, and I've written about the occupation. And it was such an abuse of Sergio's talents to have him there. It's one of the things that made me so angry about what happened after the war. And so I'd like to say something about his success. And there are so many things you could say. But I worked most closely with him in East Timor. And Samantha, when she greeted me this evening, she referred to me as a bête noire. Okay, maybe I am. But Sergio asked me to come out there. And he asked me to come out for one specific reason, which is that there was an agreement between Indonesia and Australia over oil and gas in the Timor Sea, in which he knew that if East Timor stepped into the shoes of Indonesia, split this resource 50-50, the Australians thought it was a great treaty, that the East Timorese would be screwed. And it was and so he asked me to take over that. It was one of the things I did. And it was a very difficult negotiation with the Australians, who were absolutely the mentors and the saviors of East Timor. And I became quite unpopular. I suppose I may have, in my manner, Samantha might say, added to that with my own, not nowhere near the wonderful diplomatic skills that Sergio had. But the critical thing about Sergio was that he had the courage to stick with it, because there was pressure from the Australians, there was pressure from the UN legal department, and probably from others in the UN, but he knew it was right. He stuck with it. It's one of the great achievements of the UN, and it's really his achievement in the sense that it was his idea, his support, his little smoothing out of some of my more brusque side. So it was really a kind of courage that he showed all the way through, and even at that film at the end of thinking of others. And And frankly, at my moment, as some of you may know, I have something of a quarrel the fact that the UN covered up and didn't stand up on the fraud that took place in the Afghanistan presidential elections, which it was supporting, the sort of thing that I think would not have happened if Sergio had been in Afghanistan. Not sort of thing I think wouldn't, sort of thing that wouldn't have happened. There aren't so many people on the international scene, it turns out relatively very few at the UN who really have courage, but to me, courage is the most important quality in public life, and that Sergio, although a master diplomat, as I said, he never forced anything on anyone, although he was a dictator, or anything on the Timorese, although he was the dictator there. He persuaded, but he had courage. And I just wanted, that was obvious in the way he died, but it was also something that was true in his public life that's so rare.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Claude, are you still here? Claude Brunderlein, who was part of the panel earlier, who served with him in, I think, the Balkans. Okay, well, why don't we move on to Q&A, and I'll start with Gerard Russell at this, who's from the Carr Center for Human Rights. Why don't you identify yourself and kind of tell where you're kind of situated so the panel will know that?
Thank you, Charlie. And obviously, I'm at the Carr Center. I wanted to, obviously, first of all, thank you. It's a very beautiful film. It's very inspiring. But to ask a question, building a little bit on what you were saying, Professor Power, right at the end, about the lessons to be taken from Sergio's life. It seemed to me there was one other characteristic, just from reading your book, that came across to me very strongly. It comes across rather less in the film. And tell me whether I've got it wrong, because it's something I took away from the book and have been thinking about for months afterwards, which is that a lot of the things that it seemed to me that he'd done that were best were often done in defiance of headquarters. And sometimes, even, let's say, in defiance of his particular mandate. For example, bringing the East Timorese into the government of their own country. And that kind of particular courage, the particular courage that's needed to stand up against your own rules and your own system in order to get things done. That's what I took away as the inspirational model, something that very few people in the UN have. I just wondered if you could comment on whether I've got that right or not.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you have it spot on. But it was I think Dennis McNamara in the film had it right as well, because it was the master manipulator, master massager of egos, to simply defy, to simply have the courage of his convictions and kind of say, rules be damned. He wouldn't have had the successes he had. He found a way to somehow, Carolina may wish to speak to this, but to harness the system, to sort of convince people that things that were at odds with what was in the black letter was actually their idea, and indeed in keeping with the spirit of the law in the first place. So there were definitely occasions where, in acute frustration with the red tape or the fundamental lack of imagination that he might have encountered, whether in the field or in headquarters, that he would sort of ask for forgiveness, not permission. But more often, it was actually finding a way to use, I don't think this is in the film, but constructive ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity, indeed. I mean, to sort of find daylight, almost like a good lawyer. He had 2 PhDs in philosophy, this guy, which also didn't come up in the film. But he was like the sort of best lawyer in terms of reading the text and choosing the spirit that seemed necessary in keeping with, again, the lives of the people that he was, or the critical decisions that he was trying to see made. So a little bit of a combination, not as simple as a kind of rebel within the system, not the guy of 1968, but the guy who figured out how the system worked, what was around the corners in order to, again, harness it for what were his ends and not just the ends of some resolution passed in New York.
Thank you for that question. Other microphone?
Yes, thank you. My name is Jim Toll. I graduated from the mid-career program here in 1997 and have since worked in conflict resolution and negotiation, including East Timor. So thank you to those of you who preceded me there in my work. Again, thank you to both Samantha and Greg for really capturing an incredibly emotional version of this story, and I think it was a lovely tribute to not just Sergio, but also to all people working in the UN and making the sacrifices, and a long overdue tribute to a lot of those people. I was struck in the film by the first words he said when the rescuers got to him, which was, "Don't pull me out." And I understand that that was later interpreted as, "Don't pull the mission out." And I wonder if any of the panelists could speculate on, or answer directly, what should the role of the UN be? And this in particular, because as the previous question alluded, Sergio was so famous for pushing the boundaries, pulling the barricades back so that he could be closer to the people. And in his final comment in the interview, going to the field as really a UN mission. And yet there is so much that the UN's trying to do. There really is a question about what should it be doing? And Carolina, to any extent that you remember conversations with Sergio, it might be interesting to hear about that, his reflections on that as well. Thank you.
Do you mean in terms of where to be and how to balance sort of security, mission?
The latter. So the balances of security, mission, humanitarian, political representation of the various donor nations. Where should the future of the UN go, given what Sergio is trying to do and really taking risks to make some positive progress? What would your reflections be?
I mean, it's a big question. I guess I'll just say, and I'm speaking here tonight in my personal capacity. I was told to say that by the lawyers. But I mean, I think maybe one way to answer the question is not fully satisfying, but it's just to reflect a little bit on the security mission balance that he undertook. I think he gets a bad rap, not least because of how he died and some of the decisions that were made preceding the attack. But it's really, really important to remember that, again, there was no real knowledge of al-Qaeda's presence to the degree that there was the beginnings of knowledge. It was not shared with the United Nations by the United States. But again, even for the United States, it's hard, again, the war was predicated on the link with 9/11, but then there was this period in which al-Qaeda was not the issue. There was the former Ba'athis and the former Iraqi army officers. So Sergio made a strategic choice that, as did his security people, in deference to this political judgment, which was that there needed to be an anti-green zone, the non-green zone, the place where Iraqis could actually come and not have to wait in line for 4 hours or get strip searched or whatever, and tell the story of what had happened to them that week, or what had happened under Saddam, or what they thought should happen in terms of the progression to sovereignty. In retrospect, his decision to not inconvenience Iraqis by cutting off yet another part of the city for a big international presence was the wrong one because of what we know. But again, there had never been, to that point, anything like it. Was it a failure of imagination given what bin Laden was saying? Yeah, possibly. But there were thousands and thousands of minutes or hundreds of millions of minutes in days, in months, in years, in missions around the world in which al-Qaeda hadn't, struck at the UN. I think what was far more unforgivable was in the wake of this attack not to understand that things had fundamentally changed. So, again, I mean, your question is a very broad one, but I would just say that Sergio in Bosnia used to, when people would want him to wear flak jackets, in Bosnia the UN was not a target as such, it was simply a target in the same way that the civilians were a target. And Sergio would say when his security guards would say, you've got to wear this flak jacket when you're out walking around with the civilians, he'd say, do you have any idea how fat those things make you look? And that fed this reputation, but what was actually motivating him was a desire not to be wearing a flak jacket when the people that he was talking to were completely exposed to shell fire. Now again, that was a decision he made for himself. It was an individual decision. It's one I admire. And it's one that too rarely, I think, we internationals who have these privileges of exit, privileges of armored cars, privileges of flak jackets and helmet, I mean, just the complete disconnect of having conversations with people, you know, and in a sense bringing them out of their homes to have these conversations where they're exposed. Anyway, so I think he's been, and Carolina will probably have very strong views on this, but I think been, you know, after the bomb happened, everybody looked to point fingers, and the easiest fingers were to point were those at Sergio, because he was no longer with us to defend ourselves. I mean, all I'd say on the future of the UN is the operational, I mean, when I see what the UN is doing in Haiti right now in terms of the peacekeeping and the improvements in peacekeeping performance, a long way to go. I mean, you know, these are developing country militaries. They're often learning on the job. But being able to go after escaped fugitives, again, putting their lives on the line daily, being able to somehow figure out how to clean up after an earthquake that killed 200,000 people, in conjunction, of course, with the United States, which has contributed vast amounts. I mean, this operational expertise, which lives within this institution, on the humanitarian side and on the peace and security side, to me is, you know, a place for the real concentration of resources and the real investment on the part of member states in those capabilities. But also the after actions where things go awry and how those capabilities can be enhanced. That requires more investment from member states. President Obama met with the leading troop contributors to peacekeeping, the leading police contributors to peacekeeping when he was at the UN in September. No US president had ever sat down with peacekeepers before, with the countries, with the heads of state from those countries, say, hey, what's it like out there? What do you need? What's missing? Why are there these screw-ups from time to time? You know, where does the gap between mandate and means come from? And they were kind of like, whoa, you really want to talk about it? You want to hear from us? Instead of just being the Security Council, kind of sending them off into the world and saying, best of luck, you know, we'll yell at you when you get into trouble. I mean, you know, it's a very different attitude. I'm not saying, again, that we're all the way there by any means. But I think for member states to take greater ownership and greater pride in the operational arms of the United Nations seems the right direction. Do you want to?
Yeah, might remind the audience that
You have this asset here. Like, forget you heard it from me in the film. Carolina?
it's easy to think back and think, you know, why couldn't they have seen that? But I was there in February 2003 with the Human Rights Mission and asked that same question of the UN security personnel. And it's important to remember, too, that Sergio was not in charge of security. He was the special representative of the Secretary General. But in February, what they said was, about that long road with the barrier being at the other end of the road, was that there has never been a suicide bombing in Iraq. And at that point, there hadn't been. I think there was one in July, but that was the first one. And so this was a relatively new phenomena in Iraq at the time, and not one that a lot of people had radar up about at that time. Yes?
My name is Lily Oster. I'll be a freshman at Harvard next year. I have two questions. One is for Professor Power. What influence, if any, did Sergio have on the work that you've done? Or, I mean, how did your careers overlap in any way? And then also, how can Sergio's work in East Timor and sort of the precedent that he set there be used as a model for other states that are in a similar situation that East Timor was in?
Okay, I'm going to make Carolina answer the East Timor question so she can, you now have stalling time.
Yeah.
Since your Kennedy School career is now preparing you for answering questions about statehood all around the world. I'm in government now, and it's very, very different than being here and being a professor or being a human rights advocate or a journalist. And I think the years that I spent, not with Sergio in real life we sparred a lot. I was the journalist whose job it was to say, you should do this and you should do that. I did the same thing with Peter Galbraith when he was ambassador in Croatia. I think that's the job of journalists. I now benefit when journalists do that because, you know, it either draws my attention to something or it puts pressure on me that might even help me internally. See, Peter, it was a benefit to be yelled at. Now he's in the other role. It's a lot of fun. But I think that these, so in real life, that was my role, and I can't say I was very sympathetic, to government officials or to UN officials and the kind of the number of variables that they were balancing. Spending the years with Sergio after he died, and going back and trying to reconstruct his missions, I think, and I mean, who knows how I'm influenced truly, but I have a certain patience for compromise and an understanding of the range of variables that sort of come into play. That doesn't make me any less. I mean, what was amazing about Sergio, and I hope I've taken this from him, is that he was still able to kind of find a lodestar. I think what's really important is when you make compromises in government, that you don't talk yourself into thinking that it's what you sought all along. In other words, you're negotiating with a range of different actors. You can't always get precisely what you want. But I think it's really important to remember what you wanted, and remember what you think is still the right thing. And Sergio, now in retrospect, when I look at sort of what he was saying privately versus what he was saying to me, he was fighting for the thing that I was arguing for when I was a journalist and a kind of finger wagger. But in his encounters with me, he was defending and explaining and giving the sort of larger context. And so, but I think, again, somehow, despite being the embodiment, as a UN bureaucrat, you're the embodiment not only of your own bureaucracy, but 193 member states, kind of, at least the loud ones or the influential ones. And yet, privately, he still was able to say, this is where I want to go, even if he couldn't get there. And so I think that's a really important thing. I can't say that, again, I'm batting 1,000 in being able to do that, but even just that self-awareness that the slippage is what's dangerous, I think is important. You want to speak to the Timor, like the lessons of Timor?
Maybe. So I must say that I was not planning to be in this panel, so I'm caught a little bit off guard, but I will put my grain of addition to this. And I think about this Timor is that the moment that he landed there, the first statement from the Timorese was, welcome. And immediately afterwards, the next statement was, when are you leaving? So that exemplifies the challenges of having to take upon a huge task of building a country. I wouldn't even say rebuilding, because if you say rebuilding, you start from a starting point that there are some institutions. In the case of East Timor, there was nothing to start with, and the horizon to achieve that was a limited horizon. So for Sergio, East Timor was the light of his eyes. I mean, it was like his baby. And looking, in hindsight, looking back at the work there, one of the things he always used to say, well, I'm thrown in East Timor, but there's no manual on, how you build a country. I mean, like, what do you do first? Do you hold elections, or you write the constitutions, or perhaps you first do a census? So, like, where do you start? And has somebody written about this? There was nothing, there was no manual, no training manual on how to achieve this. And in hindsight, looking at the experience of East Timor, you realize that democratization or building a new nation is a work that is done over time, over a period of time. Then in a transition like the one we were, the greatest achievement has been to actually set in place the foundations of a state, and that it is later on for its new citizens the hard task of making it work and decide how it's going to work.
I'm sure someday there'll be a book written just about that period of his life and what was achieved in East Timor, if it hasn't been written already, about what that transformation that took place there. So, if I failed to mention it, forgive me, but Carolina is a mid-career MPA student, just finishing her degree at the Kennedy School. So I'm sorry for not mentioning that when you came up here. She's one of us.
Jed Schwartz. I thought it was a very moving film, very personal, but I'm always mindful of the fact that the other side is likely to see the film. That seems to be characteristic of the era, or the other sides. People who are very religious are likely to see the film, and if you were to, for example, plan a second edition, this is a very un-Harvard thing to say. Harvard people seem to say, yes, it's wonderful, but I'm going to suggest that if you were to try and do a second edition, you might include some nuts and bolts details of the kinds of things that the Sergio-like missions are accomplishing. That is, the palpable goods and values that have been implemented as a result of these accomplishments, instead of this is more like a People magazine piece. I'm sorry. I thought it was, I was terribly moved, and it's or like Aeschylus, which would put it in a different company. Thank you.
No, thanks for your comments. I'm not going to, look, I come out of a public affairs journalistic background. From the outset, I decided I was not going to make a frontline for this. I could have made a frontline with it, and it would have been a different kind of film. I decided that this film, for lots of reasons, both on a personal level, just creatively, I wanted to take my filmmaking in a different direction. And I also felt, to be honest with you, that I wanted to connect with people who are not sitting in this room and who are not interested in the UN and who read People magazine and who read and to sort of and to speak to a wider audience. And the way I decided to do that was to make a film that was that would reach as wide a group as possible. Now that's just a choice that I made. Somebody else could make a film totally different where you sort of go through Sergio's life, and that would be a great. And I hope somebody does that. But and look at more examples. I have to say, the other sort of, we were just talking about this during the film, actually. The other issue that came up when I was looking at stories to tell from Sergio's life about his accomplishments is we were limited in terms of what resources we had. There's an amazing story, if you're familiar with Samantha's book, about Sergio helping get people smuggled out of Sarajevo during the siege. It's a fantastic story. From a filmmaking standpoint, there's just nothing there to actually to really bring it to life, except reenacting it or something. It was just, which didn't, decided not to do. It was so I was limited, to be honest with you, in some of the backstory that we could tell. And the Cambodia story was the best documented and the best told. So that's one of the reasons that we focused on that. But look, just in general, I had this take on the story from the outset, and that's the take that I just believed in. So it's a fair point, but that's what I decided to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Greg. We're going to have you out of here by 8:30, so we're going to entertain 2 more questions. And a colleague of Carolina's from Brazil has kind of wanted to follow on a point here, so I'm going to allow him, Pedro, a point of follow-up.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to Greg and Samantha to show to the people all around the world that Sérgio is not a James Bond. Fortunately, he's not a hero. He's only a human being. And being a Brazilian, being a Kennedy School alumni, I'm very proud to meet you guys here again, 7 years later. And what I feel about this film, Greg, I feel just like you. I want to keep this film tonight to bring to my kids, to show to them in Brazil, let's say tomorrow. They will understand what this man, who is committed with a mission. He lives to help the people to have a better life, to transform lives. And for the Brazilian people, thank you very much for both of you.
Thank you, Pedro. So next one at this mic.
My name is Peter, and I'm a pre-frosh. I might be coming to Harvard next year. And I'm guessing that the point of this film was to somehow inspire people to take the lesson of selflessness from Sergio and somehow apply it in their own lives, so that they can help in what little way they can to bring the world into a better place. I'm guessing that's what so I mean, I don't want anybody to take this the wrong way, but at this point, Sergio has died, and his death has caused much grief for the people that loved him and the people around him. And after his death, the war in Iraq has continued on. There's been countless lives lost, and Iraq is still a horrible place to live in. The Iraqi government is nowhere near being functional. And to be honest, East Timor is not that great of a place to live either. So then, what is it that the film is really trying to teach us to do, to aspire to in this world?
I would say it's to grapple with the world's complexities. What I really admired about Sergio was his ability to inhabit the shades of gray between whatever you want to call it, right and wrong, good or evil, and to recognize that the world is a messy place, and that you have to embrace that messiness. And what I found particularly inspiring about him was both his desire to get out in the world and do things, but also his ability to maintain his idealism, at the same time be incredibly pragmatic and try to make a difference. That doesn't mean that he sort of goes to East Timor and now it's a rosy place, because we all know that history moves on and things continue to be complicated. But he seems to me that he embraced that messiness, and that's what the message of the film for me is get out and do something with your life, and engage the other, and embrace the world in all of its complexities, and recognize that doesn't mean that one has to just sort of throw up one's hands and think, well, it's all too complicated, I can't do anything about it. Just you can, and he did.
Thank you, Greg. I was only going to take two more, but I think we have time for both questions. So let me take you, and then we'll close with Steve Brzezowski.
Yes. Douglas Klein, alumnus of Harvard College of nearly 31 years standing. Considering that Sergio joined the United Nations because he had a friend living in Geneva, and that it's extremely disadvantageous that anyone, particularly a very important person, be irreplaceable, could we say that the United Nations has been remiss in recruiting the kind of talent that it needs?
Oh, you're saying why aren't there more Sergios?
Well, essentially, yes, but since he joined the United Nations by accident, because he had a friend in Geneva, and that he was occupying such a critical role that even someone half of his ability wasn't available to replace him, that right. I really wonder if the United Nations is looking in the right place or if it's looking at all.
I think that's a very, I don't know that I would work from your logic train backwards, but I think I agree with where you end up. I mean, in that era, these organizations, this whole idea of international humanitarianism was relatively modern. I mean, it was a relatively new concept. There's now a whole, industry, criticized for being an industry, but just a proliferation of organizations where many of the students in this room will seek employment. The people come through and actually do recruitment here on campus. I think Carolina today just had a day in which she and other students brought the heads of major non-governmental organizations and other entities to make sure that the students and those NGOs or UN agencies or whatever had contact. So I think we've come a long way. But I will say this, I mean, Sergio was, Kofi Annan is right. I mean, it is going to be very, very hard to find another Sergio as such. There are very few people, even today, even graduates of this program, who have such skill sets, such experiences, but who would want to be in the field for 34 years, with only a couple exceptions being back in headquarters. I mean, there's a major toll on your personal life. I mean, to be out there always, where the rubber meets the road. A lot of people have the impatience that Sergio had with cocktail parties and with New York or with Washington or whatever, with capitals. But to really be out there seemingly never getting tired of the grind and the hardship of that life is very rare. I mean, it takes a stamina of a kind that very few people have. I know I don't have. And I really do think, people say, oh, I know my students here and I myself, we all go through phases where you want to have it all. You want to have a family, and the perfect romance, as I now do. It's right there. And you want to be out in the field and where all the action is and the adventure is, and it's very hard. I would love to get Professor Sunstein to come with me to Congo, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. Sergio, in meeting Carolina, it was a way to bring those roads together. But one of the reasons he was extraordinary was that his own innate gifts, his languages, his charisma, his power of negotiation, his intellect, et cetera. Another reason he was extraordinary is the sacrifices he made, the choices he made. And so we may have people with that combination of talents. We're also going to need people who are willing to put themselves out there. And I would settle for, half a Sergio. Somebody who was in the field half of their lives, but just at least who placed that privilege on talking to the real individuals who are themselves the ones at stake in our decision making. That's the Sergio gift. And to the earlier question, the message of the film to me is, as Greg said, it's just get out and do something. It doesn't have to be in Congo or in Timor or in Iran. It can be in Somerville, frankly. And even the way, the dignity that he attached to the individuals around him, it can be when you go pick up a cup of coffee at the Kennedy School cafeteria. There are ways to project that equality and that sense of sameness that he did, whether to a head of state or to anybody sort of working at any level, or a refugee, et cetera. There are so many lessons that are universalizable that aren't just about be a UN humanitarian and recreate what he did.
I'll tell you just
Precisely.
quickly, the number of people who've told Samantha and I about their personal interactions with Sergio. It could be like a driver or a refugee. There's a guy the security guard outside the Security Council of the UN, who he said Sergio would always come and make time for him, and they'd share an espresso before. Just the little details of and I'm sure, Caroline, you must have so many examples of people who he treated with respect and dignity when he didn't have to, because they weren't sort of important people, but he treated them the same way he treated, everybody else. And that's, on a personal level, that's something that I wish I could live up to, and that's something I've really taken away from immersing myself in his life.
So before we ask the last question, I know that we invited next year's entering class of the Kennedy School to be here if they were around this weekend or in town. Are there any of you here that will be entering next year?
Up at the tippy top.
Oh, good. We see one or two.
They give you the cheap seats.
Yeah.
Treating you like royalty.
Certainly a lot going on this weekend. Steve, we'll let you have the last question. Identify yourself and where you're from.
Hi, Stephen Brzezowski. I work at the Carr Center. Thank you all for a great night. Documentary studies I'm really passionate about, so following Professor Power's directive to ask Carolina a question, and also Greg, if you can chime in. I'm interested in the power of testimony and the role that trauma plays in kind of films, and asking people, to kind of relive these traumatic stories. So I always find in my studies, not personally, but it has a transformative effect. And I wonder in your work, what you've seen with Ghost of Rwanda, and Carolina, if you'd like to answer that as well. Thanks.
A transformative effect on
the witness.
On the witness. Well, what do you think? How did you feel after those 9 hours we spent together?
Or today?
Transformative is a big word, I think.
I think that there is something very, okay. Again, this is not prepared. I wasn't preparing myself to come today and answer questions. But I think that there is, when you're anonymous, and that's my telephone. When you're anonymous and you suddenly have to articulate your story, there is something really unsettling about that. You are concerned about how is that going to be read by the different people. On the other hand, there is something really powerful about owning your own story, and that it is your story. And whatever happened, it belongs to you, and you can transform it. Having said that, I cannot stop but think of Sergio and how much he always said that he wanted to write his own story, and even toying with a title about his own story, and not ever having really the time to sit down and start doing it. And I haven't, in all honesty, I haven't watched the movie, and I have read the script. You probably I would probably want to know from you whether you will advise me to watch the movie or not. From what I know in the script that I read, it's a wonderful, inspirational a piece that Greg has put so much effort and input into something graphic, something that otherwise is very hard that it reaches a wide audience, and for that I cannot but be thankful at reaching out to the many people that once this comes out will be touched by him. Having said that, I also think that I have divergences over his portrayal, and whether he would have, he himself genuinely would have actually agreed with that portrayal, that the documentary, from what I read, portrays him as a womanizer, and that's not the way I remember him, or the way that he would have thought of himself or seen himself. This was a person who lived his life with lots of passion for life. And so that is my only observation in setting the record straight and understanding the benefits and detrimental factors of narrative.
Yeah, thank you, Carolina. I mean, I think when somebody tells you a story, particularly one as profound and as intimate as Carolina's, you know, it's a deep responsibility. I'm making a film, and so I take your story and everyone else's story and put it together and give my own interpretation of it. So it's a subjective interpretation, and I find that my only guide is not necessarily what others may think or what my participants may think, but just my own sense of where the story wants to go and needs to go. A documentary film, what's exciting about it, what's very hard about it, is that you enter a cutting room with hundreds of hours of interview material and footage and all that, and unlike a narrative film where you have a script that you go shoot, the film could be anything. There are an infinite number of films that one can make out of one's material in the cutting room. The film, it sounds strange, but it actually wants to go in a certain direction. And you follow that, and it finds its own course. And that's never always where you might have thought it was going to be from the outset. In terms of a transformative effect for the witnesses, it's an interesting question. I would never sort of tell somebody, come to an interview, it's going to have a transformative effect for you. I think people know their story, and I'm just humbled when people agree to tell it. And I think, you know, no, so I never think of it. I think actually one can overstate that. I mean, I'm thrilled to hear you say you feel like it's a process of owning one's story. But I think it's also incredibly vulnerable because you are handing a story over to a filmmaker who can do with it what they will. And you will have quibbles with it, perhaps some profound differences with it. And once that session is over, you have no control over it. And that's just the way it is. So it's, I think one can overstate it, actually. And, yeah.
The power of the moment when they tell that story.
Well, the power of the moment is amazing, you know, and it's almost like and I try to create, and I hope we created a kind of an intimate setting where, you know, we were in a big conference room in a hotel, but with a crew and lights and all that, but I try to create this space where it's just me and the subject, and we just talk, and everything else goes away. And Carolina was amazing, I mean, because if you had any reservations going into it, they disappeared. And I remember when you were looking off to the side once, I said to you, I said, you see Sergio there, don't you? And you said, yes, I do. And you were right there in that moment. And it was, you know, it was humbling to be a part of that. And I think the film sort of captures that intensity. And I think that's, frankly, what makes documentaries, when they work, what makes them so powerful, because you are seeing people at their most honest. And it's just, it's gripping. And if it's an amazing story and all that, I think it's the most powerful way to convey ideas through emotion. And I'm just thankful for Carolina and everyone else, Andre, Bill, Gil, who opened themselves up like she did for this film. And for Samantha, of course, for the amazing work that she had that was the foundation for it. And so thank you very much, Samantha. It's been a great journey.
As a physician who has worked with a lot of people who have been traumatized and suffer PTSD, I would agree with Greg. I think we have to be cautious about the transformative effect. I think telling your story can be a beginning of healing, but how that story is received, if it's denigrated, if it's cheapened, if it's not heard with dignity and worth, then I think it can be destructive. So it depends in part on how that story is responded to. So I would like to conclude tonight with some words that were sent to me actually when I was in an internet cafe in Baghdad in February 2003, about 6 weeks before the war began. I was quite devastated by some things I'd seen in a pediatric hospital that day. And someone wrote to me, and I'd sent this message and it kind of ricocheted around the world because I told friends to share it. And someone wrote to me and said, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, walk humbly now, love mercy now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And I think that in some ways characterized Sergio's life. And I would like to thank Greg for making the film. I would like to thank Samantha for writing the book. I would like to thank Carolina for telling her story and Sergio's, and thank the Institute of Politics and the Carr Center for sponsoring this event, and for all of you for coming tonight to share this remarkable evening. So thank you and good night.